everybody, and thank you for coming out on this very cold and windy day and coming to this Pyrmont History Talk. As you probably have noticed, this will be an unashamedly family affair. My name's Mary Hickson, and I'm the matriarch.
And my name is Jem Hickson. I'm the granddaughter.
And we would like to introduce the Hickson speakers for this talk titled
History since 9/11, a 3G view.
Firstly, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways which we enjoy today, the Gadigal, and we pay our respects to their elders, past and present. We also honour the memory of our beloved Donald Denoon, the 2011 original convener of this wonderful Pyrmont History Group.
History. It is the stuff of remembering, analysing and enjoying what happened in the past and how it may impact on our present and future.
We've had over 100 talks at Pyrmont History Group since starting in 2011, when Donald and Mary and others convened the first meeting. Most have touched on the colourful history of Pyrmont over the last 150 years. Some have been more contemporary, such as Paul Limmer's very popular take on a local building manager. It was the most well-attended talk, I think. And then there was Ken Saunders, who had a funny mapping of Mars as Pyrmont's nearest solar system neighbour.
Today we have a 3G presentation that is 3 generations exploring their different takes about what the history since 9/11, about what makes it so historic. You might be familiar with ABC's Hard Quiz hosted by Tom Gleeson. This is the show where the contestants choose their own expert subject regardless of how wacky or exotic that subject may be. This results in very strange combinations. Well, tonight is a bit like the Hard Quiz. So let's introduce you to our contestants. Speakers.
So firstly there's Pete, the grandfather, the patriarch, who sees the history since 9/11 as unprecedented in its physical changes and impacts on our world. His expert historical subject tonight is a strange one for some of us. It's steel.
Bethany is the granddaughter and my sister. She is 12 years old, but has packed a lot into those 12 years. She lived in Germany for nearly 4 years, so did I, and learned to speak German. She's in 6th grade in North Sydney and is her school's captain. She loves public speaking. Living in a world of mobile phones and the internet, her historical interest since 9/11 is the rise of the mobile phone and social media.
Then thirdly we have Michael, Bethany's father and my and Pete's son, and he has found himself in the thick of automation technology ever since graduating from Sydney University in 2002 in mechatronics engineering. His expert historical subject is the rise and endpoint of automation and artificial intelligence. So as Tom Gleeson would say,
let's play hard.
Well, thank you, Gemma and Grandnets, as we call the matriarch. I love history, and I certainly love coming to these Pyrmont history gatherings. And while these gatherings tend to look backwards, certainly over the last 100 years as a source of our history, and even last month we went back 2 centuries to talk about Governor Bligh, I've had a sort of sneaking feeling in my gut that maybe we're missing something, or maybe there's another area we can go in the Pyrmont History Group, and that is the last 20 years. And really, the question is the last 20 years, has it been really historic? And have we noticed? Now, history clearly is relative, where one sense of history and one sense of time really depends on the age of the observer. different generations see history differently. And so that's why I'm delighted that Bethany and Michael have joined me in this 3D presentation on the history of since 9/11. And when I was growing up in the 50s, that is a long time ago, Bethany, I remember my father used to talk often about the Great Depression. And he used to talk it in terms of like it happened yesterday and how tough it was. And he had this one image that I still remember. And he talked about the pile of bills that used to stack up. And a new bill had come in and it'd be put on the top of the pile. And when the money came in, they'd take a bill from the bottom and pay it. And so it was a pretty tough time. But I think we got fed these stories about how tough it was to sort of elicit possible gratitude from some of us children. Nevertheless, despite all of that, I had a sense that I was pretty irritated as a child. I think I was too scared or unable to articulate my frustrations. But if I could, it would have been something like, "Come on, Dad, get a life. It's a long time ago. Get over it." And now that I am older than my father ever was, I think I can understand where he was coming from. In the sense that in the 50s, the Great Depression, being only 20 years old for my dad, felt like yesterday. And so it is with me when I look back at 9/11. It feels like yesterday. So I better put the slide up. So here we are. We've got the history since 9/11. And last Wednesday was the 11th of September. In US parlance, that is 9/11. They always put the month first. So that's where this 9/11 comes from. And last Wednesday, it was 25 years since that terrible event. And I guess most of us in this room can remember it quite distinctly. We happened to be living at London at the time, and my daughter Anna here, we've done a pretty good job at branch stacking this afternoon, so forgive us. But my daughter Anna here was watching television. She yelled out, "Hey Mum, come and have a look at this. 2 planes had just flown into the Twin Towers in New York," which Dad happened to be in a month ago. And so that was our first impression and enduring memory of 9/11. And in a sense, it's become a prominent marker in our historical consciousness, just like the Great Depression was for my father. So having said that, I look over to Bethany and she's probably saying, "What are you talking about, Grant Pete? Get over it. It's a long time ago. It was 10 years before I was born." So hence the sense that history is relative. I could have titled this talk differently. I could have said it's the history since the coming of Jackson's Landing. And Donald would prefer that title because Donald always would like to see these Pyrmont history talks having a Pyrmont connection. But the message this afternoon, as the three of us go through this little exercise, the message is, regardless of whether your historical marker is 9/11 or the opening of Jackson's Landing in 2000, 2001, what we are describing in terms of the changes, which are remarkable, have happened since then. So that's the consciousness that we would like to raise in you, is that all we're talking about this afternoon has happened in the last 23 years. The 9/11 itself had quite a few unexpected, unintended consequences. We can all recall the US under George Bush got very angry about their Twin Towers being destroyed, and that created a significant reaction. Obviously, the US fairly quickly decided to invade Afghanistan, and then shortly after that also invaded Iraq. And that itself created a whole series of events that changed our political landscape pretty seriously over the last 20 years. One effect has been that the consequences of unilateral invasion, which was that of Afghanistan and Iraq, has been quickly followed through the last 20 years, and it's left us with the tragedy of Ukraine. It's also, when we think about the women of Afghanistan, despite all of the efforts and all of the money, the women of Afghanistan really haven't improved at all under the current conditions. And of course, the Middle East, as we all know, remains a powder keg. One of the really interesting consequences of this was that China, of all countries, was traumatized by the instability that came about through 9/11. Certainly the invasion of Iraq, the behavior of countries. China was coming into an environment where they'd had a pretty good 1990s. The growth was starting to look good. The social stability was good. And then the events of 9/11 really worried China. And they decided, the government there decided to act. They decided that they needed to stimulate their own economy, create more independence in their economy, particularly with the increased urbanisation of their country. And there goes one of the hecklers. And they set about really focusing on urbanisation and also residential development. Now, the issue here is that the speed and the scale of China's industrial rise since 9/11 is unprecedented and certainly unexpected, including China itself. We all know vaguely we all talk about how China's really changed and China's really big, and we know that when we go down to Bunnings, everything that we buy is made in China. But the question this afternoon is, how big and how historic has this change been? Now, one of the problems with this is that the reason we don't look at things historically in the last 20 years or so is because we're very close to it. It's hard to see the big picture, especially with our media these days. The rise of misinformation, the noisy views that we get on the media. Certainly the conflicting political views, it makes it very difficult to make a judgment about any local and near-term events. Certainly Bethany's going to talk a little bit more about social media and the impact that we've experienced over the last 20 years. So thinking about this problem, this is where I have come to my expert subject, steel. Steel, I see, is one of the things that I can use to illustrate just how significant China's rise has been in the last 20 years. Steel is one of these things that it's the basis of our civilization. It's everywhere in our lives. We see them certainly in all of the things that we buy, fridges, washing machines, houses, buildings. It's quite interesting the last couple of weeks, seeing here in Pyrmont the massive use of steel and the metro constructions and how quickly that's all gone up. And the fish markets themselves have also been a massive use of steel. So we are using steel in Pyrmont, and that's a sign of our prosperity here in Pyrmont. The good thing about steel is that it doesn't lie. You can count it, you can measure it, you can't really hide it, and it can be easily fact-checked. So consequently, steel statistics are widely used all over the world by economists to describe really what's happening in the economy, as distinct from what politicians and pundits the same in the economy. So just to talk about steel, really to illustrate the point about how useful steel is in describing historical contexts, I've looked at the last century in the eyes of steel. And I'm sorry to persecute you with all these graphs on a Sunday afternoon, but I couldn't think of any other way of making this point. Now you can see that the first industrial revolution that everyone talks about happened back in the 1860s, 1850s, and that was all focused on iron and steel. So when we came into the start of the century, steel production was something like 50 million tonnes. So don't worry about the number, but it's a pretty small number. And it rose gently, and by the start of the First World War, it got to about 90 million tonnes. And then it sort of wandered up and down during the Depression here in this little thing. It got back to 65 million tonnes. And then we had the Second World War, where steel consumption got up to nearly 180 million tonnes. So it was quite, as you would imagine, building more tanks and ships, and the whole effort of the war used a lot of steel. Then after the war, things got really dreary, and by the end of sort of the 1940s, we had steel was back to like 90 million tonnes, and really, as industrial revolutions go, it was a bit of a damp squid in the first half of last century. Then you had this amazing rise in steel consumption throughout the world, and that was associated with the post-war boom. That's when Japan and Germany reconstructed, we had baby booms, we had housing booms, and steel consumption rose quite dramatically through that period till about the 1970s. Then we were hit with inflation and interest rates and the Vietnam War, and steel consumption throughout the rest of the century was pretty meagre and moved sideways. This chart shows here that blue is the rest of the world and the orange is China. So the chart does show that throughout that century, we started to see from 1968 the rise of becoming of China. They were using small amounts of steel, but by the end of before 9/11, China was the largest producer and consumer of steel. I had the opportunity in my previous life to visit China, and I first went to China in 1997, and I talked to the steel producers and planners there, and they had a sense that at this stage that was probably as good as it's going to get for China. They thought that if they had 150 million tonnes of steel, that's probably what they'll need year in, year out. But as I mentioned, after 9/11, the dramatic changes in the government's expectation, and that was in a sense driven by the fact that China was such a large country, had 1.4 billion people, 1,450 million people in China. That's 50 times the population of Australia. There were 5 large cities like Shanghai, which is Shanghai here. This is actually a picture of Shanghai last year. All of these buildings were not there at 9/11. This, as we look out here in Shanghai, this is Pudong, and that was a rice field in 9/11's time. So China had all of these cities. They were building high rises. Most of the residential buildings were 30-story high, and they used a lot of steel. The question is, how much steel did they use, and how does that compare to what we saw in the 20th century? And this is the story. And this is in terms of trying to get a sense of the perspective. Here we have China, this orange part, and by the end of last year, China had doubled the world's steel consumption. So if you take steel as a measure of the essence of an economy, China is now twice as large in terms of its economic impact on the physical world as the rest of the world. So the chart here, still blue as the rest of the world. The rest of the world has risen mildly in terms of its steel consumption, but China has gone to this point. Now, that's my first point for this afternoon. The extent of the change since 9/11 is illustrated by China now doubling the world's steel production and consumption. And in terms of industrial revolutions, that is an industrial revolution we've never seen in our history. And this is in fact the real industrial revolution that's impacting our physical world. You might say, well, okay, it's all pretty esoteric, and how does that affect Piedmont here in 2024? The first observation I'd make is that, the history of Piemont's pretty circular. Back in 1900, Piedmont was the liveliest, densest part of Sydney. Sydney was the city of Australia, which was the second richest country in the world. And the origin of that wealth was mainly the exports that Australia produced in terms of minerals and wool and wheat, and of which Piedmont is very much a big part of. And so we've had this history of Piedmont at the start of last century being this exciting, dense living place. We've had a rise and fall in terms of industrialisation in Piedmont. We've got Michael Matthews' book at the back there that talks about Piedmont being the sink of Sydney in the 1980s. And certainly since 9/11, we've had a new Piedmont. We're now back to where we were 100 years ago, the most dense and liveliest community in Sydney. We've also had a period of time where economic growth has been unprecedented in Australia. We've gone for 20 years without a recession, whereas most other countries have had several recessions in the same period. Raises the question, why is it so? And one of my propositions here this afternoon is that this Chinese steel story has had a dramatic impact on Australia, and one specific impact has been the way it's affected our exports, and our biggest export is this funny brown stuff called iron ore. And for every tonne of steel, you need about 1.5 to 2 tonnes of iron ore. And Australia is the major supplier of iron ore to China. China does have some of its own iron ore, but it mainly gets iron ore from Australia and Brazil. And again, coming back to the thesis of what's happened since 9/11, here we are in 9/11 in 2001. We've got the rest of the world taking a bunch of iron ore and China taking a little bit at the top. And since then, the rest of the world has gone sideways in terms of its take of iron ore. But China has gone to a point where we've got nearly 900 million tonnes of iron ore going out from Australia, and all of it going to China. And the wealth effect of that, I would suggest, has been one of the reasons why we are living in a prosperous Piedmont, and certainly a prosperous Australia. That's the first observation. The second one would be that every tonne of iron ore produces about 2 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So the proposition, because we've had this dramatic impact of China's growth, we've also had a dramatic impact in carbon emissions. And we all talk about this in the news, and but again, it's the quantum of carbon dioxide that's gone into the atmosphere, which is the significant feature. Now, I've charted here the carbon emissions from energy generation. That's power generation. And again, the story is that the green is the rest of the world, the blue here is India, and the red is China. And again, in the last 20 years, since 9/11, we've had carbon emissions because of, in this particular case, energy, but it mirrors through other sectors. Essentially, our carbon emissions, because of the impact of China, has gone up 50%. So that is an issue, and that sort of partly explains why we are facing such a debate about climate and climate impacts. It's partly due to this physical impact of the last 20 years of China. So with that darker story, it's my turn to move on, and I'll hand it over to Beth, because she's the younger generation. She's going to solve all of these problems that we are leaving her. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Bethany, and I was born in 2012, which is halfway through the history since 9/11. Today, I'm going to be talking about how technology, particularly phones and social media, has changed since 9/11 and my experience of it. Technology since 9/11. I'm told by young Pete that a BlackBerry was a phone, not a fruit. In fact, it was the first ever smartphone that was released in 2002, just after 9/11. It was called Smart because it was the first mobile phone to access the internet. Before that, you needed a personal computer to access the internet. In June 2007, Steve Jobs, who was running Apple at the time, released the first Apple iPhone. When the iPhone came out, the BlackBerry sales slowly began to drop. At its peak, the BlackBerry was selling nearly 50 million phones per year and sold 250 million phones compared to the 2.3 billion iPhones sold. And by 2023, a total number of 17 billion smartphones sold all over the world. It wasn't just the numbers of the phones sold that were historic. It was also that each iPhone got increasingly smarter. So as you can see here, the orange line represents the BlackBerry and the blue line is the iPhone. And by 2011, the BlackBerry had started its descent and the iPhone just kept getting sold. iPhone 4 introduced games and FaceTime in 2010. iPhone 5 in 2012 included maps that could guide you in your car or on walks, and interactive maps could track your progress. iPhone 8, released in 2017, could translate languages and read your Face ID. iPhone 12 in 2020 could monitor your health. Every new model increased the computing power and storage. iPhone 15 Pro, released in 2023, has 100 times the computing capacity of 3 supercomputers of the 1990s. So, when it comes to smartphones since 9/11, there are 2 really historic outcomes. Number 1, the number of smartphones has exploded around the world, roughly 3 for every person. And number 2, smartphones are so much smarter. It is now like having a supercomputer in your hands. I'd like to offer one more graph before I move to my personal experience. The dramatic takeoff of the internet users since 9/11 can be seen in this chart and is mainly due to the number of smartphones. The total internet users in the world is close to 6 billion. That is up 10 times in 20 years. This chart shows how our world has become very networked. The historic change on the internet was not only the number of users, but the amount of data that was being stored. As you can see in this graph, the internet users keeps going up, and this was mainly because of the smartphones and how they have evolved. So, does this technological advancement make it better for us? My experience of technology. Last year, phones became a big part of my life. I was in year 5 at school, and many of my friends already had their own phone. I began to talk to my parents about maybe getting a phone, just putting the idea out there. Then, people in my grade started mainly communicating by phones, and I decided that I wanted my own phone. Understandably, my parents were very reluctant to their 11-year-old owning a phone, but I expressed to them that I was missing out. After a few months and a lot of discussion, we got Mum's old phone to use as a family phone, and then my problems began to go away. Although I didn't have exclusive access to the phone and my parents could give it to my sister at any time, I did feel that it allowed me to connect with my friends in a way that I hadn't been able to do before. I had strict screen time limits and I wasn't allowed on any social media or big group chats, but it was working. This year, some new problems arose. Many of my friends are getting social media, and even though I don't have it myself, I've seen it affect the people I know, and just in general, my generation. I've watched young people, particularly young girls, develop mental illnesses, eating disorders, and suffer from addiction because of social media. This is why I want to stay away from it. As you can see in this chart, the mental health hospitalisations in Australia has just increased by 80% for girls and 50% for boys, which is absolutely massive. And this is because of, in 2008, the front-facing camera evolved. So that's when all of these stats began to rise. Next year, I'll be going into year 7. I wonder how I will cope without social media. How will it affect me? Will I be isolated? Will the decision to not have social media still be the best choice? I'm still optimistic though, and I'm glad to have this experience and watch how technology has shaped me. But I wonder what technological fruit will shape my children. We've had the BlackBerry, we've got the Apple. What's next? The Nectarine?
Thanks, Beth. Great job, and she's a tough act to follow. As Gemma said, my name's Michael, and my subject area is automation and robotics, something that I've been working with for the last 22 years. As Mum said, I graduated from University of Sydney with a mechatronics degree, which is a kind of degree that's a combination of software, electrical, and mechanical engineering. And I've spent all my professional career working in automation, robotics, and more recently, decarbonisation, mostly in the field of container ports in Australia and in Europe. Because from that background, you'd think that I'm pretty optimistic in terms of technology. But on the contrary, I've through my career, seen these twin problems of technology. Firstly, how difficult it can be to make these cutting-edge technologies work. For example, driverless vehicles. And secondly, we see this trend of the development of new technologies without really use cases that would support them. For example, blockchain, if you remember that. Robotics in particular has been a very difficult technology to make with a lot of incremental gains. Mostly, in my view, because of our underestimation in the skill and intelligence of the human operator, which robotics is trying to augment. Implementing cost-effective technology takes time, takes planning, and takes a lot of money, a lot of investment, which sometimes gets lost in the hype and the dash for cash. Nevertheless, there's a time of fast-moving change in technology, and specifically automation enabled by artificial intelligence. And it's my job today to round out this history since 9/11 by addressing the emerging technology of artificial intelligence, or AI, which is likely to dominate the history of the next 20 years like the smartphone and the internet has done in the last 20 years. Now for something different after all those charts. So this slide shows the entry into this year's Sulman Prize by the artist Wan Wei in the New South Wales Art Gallery. The painting asks the question, will ChatGPT change our world? The face represents an AI robot and attempts to depict a world of AI in which inorganic life has replaced organic life. And you can see in the background the arc of mankind over here, moving into space and searching for a new home. My first reaction when I saw this painting was one of skepticism. I felt that it described an outcome that was highly exaggerated and unlikely to occur. But after further consideration about AI and its most concrete application at the moment, this application called ChatGPT, I've started to change my tune. I think this technology does have indeed a high chance of being revolutionary, and I'll explain why. My niece is 22 years old, Bethany's cousin, and she's completing her university studies at ANU in Canberra. While I was chatting to her the other night, the topic turned to ChatGPT. She uses it for many things, she said: planning travel, generating ideas, proofreading, developing computer code, checking computer code. But the really interesting thing is what she said next. She said that the younger cohort of university students, those who are 18 and 19, they use it for absolutely everything. Bill Gates said he's seen only 2 demonstrations of truly revolutionary technology. The Windows operating system, obviously, which has made him the world's richest man. But the second was a company called OpenAI. In mid-22, Bill Gates challenged OpenAI to train its ChatGPT application so that it could pass an advanced placement biology exam. OpenAI finished the task in 2 months. Gates was expecting it to be years. Its success suggested that AI has arrived. It propelled ChatGPT to becoming the fastest consumer internet product to reach 100 million users. And it did that in just 2 months. So this is a graph that shows the comparison of ChatGPT compared to other popular platforms. The Google Translate, for example, here took 78 months. Spotify, 55 months. TikTok, very famous, 9 months to get 100 million users, and ChatGPT, just 2 months. So why is this happening now? AI has been around for a long time, or at least the ideas and the concepts of AI have been around for a long time. But it was in a kind of ice age for the last 20 years, unable to develop because of the state of the technology. But around 2010, 3 things changed that enabled it to go forward. Algorithms, the data, and the chips, not the chips you eat, but the computer chips. Firstly, in the change of algorithms. So there's some. So what was the main advance there? Was there a new type of algorithm, new type of program capable of solving problems by discovering patterns? So-called large language models. You may have heard that term before. And they work by being trained after analysing billions of words from books, articles, and websites to identify patterns. And after they've been trained, so to speak, they are capable of answering complex questions and even producing text that's somewhat fluid. The second change was the availability of data. Remember Bethany's chart about the rise of internet users and the data? In 2010, there was 2 zettabytes of data. By 2023, there are 120 zettabytes of data, so that's gone up 60 times 60 times the amount of data since 2010. This chart tries to kind of illustrate that point. So the vertical scale is the number of words, and the horizontal scale here is the time. This red line down the bottom is the average number of words heard or read by a human in their lifetime. That's roughly 1 billion. 1 billion words a human hears. This next line here, this brown line, is the number of words on the English version of Wikipedia. So 5 billion words. The ChatGPT-1 was trained on 80 billion words. And it didn't really work. GPT-3 was the big breakthrough, trained on 250 billion words. So it's 250 times more than what we would read in a lifetime. And this is what Bill Gates described as revolutionary. This was so advanced that many people had difficulty distinguishing between the news stories generated by the model and those written by human authors. GPT-3 had the spin-off called ChatGPT, which is specifically fine-tuned for conversational tasks. GPT-4 has also been released, which is trained on 4,000 billion words. So it's 4,000 more words than you would hear in a lifetime. And finally, you have the green line up the top here, which is the estimate of all the words in all human publications throughout all history, which is 10,000 billion. So that was the second one. So we've had algorithms, we've had data, and the third, I guess, enabler of AI has been these chips, these different types of computer hardware. And the company really behind that is a company called NVIDIA. So it's a US company, of course, which has a Taiwanese-American CEO. And the chips they make are called graphical processing units, or GPUs. NVIDIA is one of the only companies that can make these chips. And this company now is worth more than $3 trillion US, which is now the third largest company in the world behind Microsoft and Apple. It took Microsoft 25 years to go from 100 billion to 3,000 billion in market value. It took NVIDIA 5 years. And interestingly, NVIDIA's background is actually in computer games. So the GPUs that they use are used heavily to make the graphics in the modern games like Call of Duty. If you don't know, but your kids and grandkids probably play them. So it's really interesting that the video games industry is kind of an accidental step in the evolution of AI. There are many issues obviously confronting AI development. And the three that come to mind are the scale of the data, the computing power, and of course the electrical power, the energy needed to operate AI. So only the well-funded US big tech companies can really afford AI development. OpenAI spent $1 billion developing ChatGPT, and it costs nearly $1 million a day to operate. Universities and other institutions can't compete with that anymore. Many of the original AI developers are now saying we need to stop and assess the risks before rapid development of AI can continue. Geoffrey Hinton, one of the godfathers of AI, resigned from his job at Google so that he could speak more freely about the ethical challenges of AI. The two biggest that come to mind are jobs, the effect on jobs, obviously, and the flood of information that is potentially and often, unfortunately, full of untruth, and it's sometimes a form of propaganda. There's an open letter produced by 1,000 AI industry leaders pointing to the risks of around a loss of control of our civilization. It kind of takes us back to that Silman Prize entry asking the same question about AI. The other emerging issue is energy and power that is used to train and operate these models. GPUs, these graphical processing units, require a lot of power. ChatGPT handles 200 million queries a day, which consumes enough electricity that could supply some 23,000 US households. US data centers are projected to use 8% of total power in 2030. That's up from 3% in 2022. Even locally, we are seeing the effects of this in Pyrmont and Ultimo. So if you drive along Pyrmont Street, you'll notice a lot of works to enable new cabling. There are 2 conjoined data centres, one on 392 Harris Street, known as Sydney West, and 273 Pyrmont Street, known as Sydney East. So they are being expanded and will add another 48 megawatts of power demand, taking them to a combined total of 90 megawatts of power. So to give you some context to that, just 300 metres away from Sydney West is the old Ultimo Power Station, which is the site of the troubled Powerhouse Museum. And in its heyday, it produced 80 megawatts of power to run the trams and trains of Sydney, which is less than just these 2 data centres require. So with the myriad of social and economic and political impacts, governments are moving to put new guardrails on AI technology. EU has passed its AI Act, US is close behind with their AI Bill of Rights, and China is believed to be introducing something similar to the European model. But given the global political distractions, one wonders whether they'll be too little, too late. But not to an end on a negative note, the potential for AI, for economic growth, for improvements in all kinds of services, including medical and education, is truly historic. Despite the speed and capacity of AI, it must be said that the common conclusion from my niece and other users is that it cannot replace human intelligence, judgment, and deliberative thought. We need to, and we are, I think, learning to delegate to AI the tasks at which it excels at, while we strengthen our commitment to judgment, the common good, and human flourishing. All right. We get back to our compares.
Thank you, Dad. Michael, Bethany, and Pete, for your courageous effort in tackling such a broad but relevant topic. History since 9/11.
Well, I don't know about you, but that was all mind-boggling, and I'm sure there are some questions out there for our 3 speakers. So please, if you have a question, Gemma will come over to you with the microphone so that you can be heard. And our speakers will sit here and wait for your questions.
Hi. Some years ago, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, the late Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking, and others called for a moratorium on AI development, and that didn't happen. And it's continuing on at an even faster rate. And one of the things that was inherent in your presentation, I think, is that manipulation of data is not the same as wisdom. A lot of my students, I'm a professor of law at Notre Dame University, and a lot of my students have tried to submit papers based on AI, and they lack depth. And if you ask AI a complicated question in philosophy, it cannot answer it. It doesn't know, it doesn't have the knowledge underlying the question. A good example of this is the distinction between values and virtues, which is a fairly sophisticated and difficult area that most people don't know anything about. And if you ask AI, with all that extraordinary data you referred to, it produces gobbledygook, and that's extraordinary. And I'd like your comment on that, because it seems to me that manipulation of data is not wisdom. And the speed of it, and the complexity of it, and the sheer amount of it is never going to substitute, as I think you hinted in your concluding comment, for a kind of deeper wisdom and knowledge. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, I agree. With the sentiment of your comment, and the intention I guess was to express a similar point of view. I think from my survey, from the discussions with people who use AI regularly, the general feedback is that it's still a long way from perfect. It does create information, or supposedly creates text, but as you pointed out, it's still, from my view and my feedback, it's still kind of obvious that it's flawed, and that in some respects obvious that it's created by a computer. And one could sort of conclude from that it'll never be able to do. It'll never be able to sort of automate people away completely. That there's always going to be a ceiling on what its capabilities are. But on the other hand, though, there is sort of this rapid improvement, and where it gets to in the end, like I'm not. It'd be a brave person, I think, to say that it could never, I guess, completely fool us. Like it's hard to, I guess, understand or predict what the natural ceiling on its capabilities are. But certainly at the moment, I think in the current state, there is a limit to what it can do. It certainly can't do the things that you described, and it's certainly at the moment obvious that when it produces a text, it's certainly to some extent obvious that it's kind of produced by AI. But yeah, things are changing rapidly, so we will say.
It's just interesting too that just this last week there was a commentary about the quality of data and the process that some of these models are now using generated data, and it's in the process of using generated data, the quality of the data is improving poorer and poorer. So I think it's a moving feast in the sense that we're not too sure what's going to come next, but there are some hidden traps along the way.
Hi, Michael. You mentioned AI with regard to driverless cars. With respect to technology being logarithmic in its cycle, what's your take on how long will be before driverless cars are the thing in that many countries around the world have already got them? How quickly will we get to the stage where that is the normal?
That's a difficult question as well. I think it depends a little bit on the actual use case. So I think to some extent, like as you point out, they exist already. They tend to exist in areas where the domain is defined or somehow constrained. So in the industry I work in, where there's a kind of defined environment or a constrained environment, they work. They obviously, in some cities where there's a kind of defined operating environment, they function. So I think to some extent, the technology is evolved and is already functional in many use cases. To the extent where it's going to completely work under every single condition and obviate the need for any human drivers, it's hard to see that day ever happening. I think there'll always be constraints around driverless vehicles. But like my dad was saying, it is a moving target, and to some extent it's the same as the previous question. It's a moving target, and it's hard to know what the ceiling is in terms of its usability. And certainly, the technology changes have been unprecedented, and the same could be said for driverless vehicles. That there could be a day where they they're everywhere. But But I personally can't see that happening, but you know, we need to sort of watch and see.
This is a question to all three in age order. Just wondering, with social media and AI and steel, would anybody be interested in what a robot does and be wanting to publish that? Would there be a robot that anybody would be interested in, and would it be made of steel? Start in any order.
Well, I'm confused by the question, but would if the robot be made of steel?
Yes.
In most cases, it is made of steel, and certainly a lot of these industries are now have robots working in them. And again, I point to the Chinese, that in a lot of industrial applications, the Chinese are way in front in a lot of this technology. And I think that's one of the surprises over the last 20 years, is that we need to think differently about China in terms of its technological expertise, and not only that, its technological leadership. Now, Michael was in China just a couple of weeks ago, so he can talk some more about that. You want to pass?
Yeah, I suppose just to add to that, yeah, I think yeah, absolutely. China is leading in many areas, many technological areas. So it's a bit off topic. The focus of my trip last time was in the more decarbonisation space and battery electric vehicles and trucks, and yeah, they're absolutely pushing ahead there. And interestingly too, a lot of the new technologies in that space are dominated by Chinese companies, and there's a certain, I guess, convergence happening there too, in terms of the major Chinese companies that are leading that. BYD being one, and CATL, which is another, which is a supplier to Tesla. So yeah, I'm not sure if that got your original question, but yeah, that's how we interpreted it.
Will people be interested in it like we're interested in people? That's like we're very interested if Britney Spears comes to Sydney.
Right.
Or we're very interested if Taylor Swift is there. We're very interested. Are we interested if a robot visits from China? That's just a thought.
I was just trying to understand the question, but thank you. I think that really depends on what the age group is and what the robot does. If it's a dancing robot, then maybe. But yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because and I'm sorry, this may have been a boring topic to some people, but I think my major message is that we don't talk about these sorts of issues enough. We talk about Britney Spears and what have you, but I think if we want to understand, we've got a lot of complex problems facing us, and I think one of the important fundamentals is that we have a clear understanding of what the causes are. And this is why we come back to history, because I think history teaches us to think about, well, that's happened, why did it happen? And to try and identify these major driving forces. And I guess the essence of, well, the main sort of objective of this afternoon is to sort of try and identify what are the big issues out there that have happened, and most of us have been oblivious to it. And I put it to you that I'm sure nobody in this room realises the extent of China's physical impact over the last 20 years, since 9/11. Thank you, Bob. Oh, there's Uncle Lam. Got to get Uncle Lam. That could be a very tough question.
Michael, you mentioned the enormous use of power, and I wonder whether governments are giving the right amount of importance. We certainly don't hear about it here. And my question is the enormous use of power largely in creating the AI machine, or whatever you call it, or program, or is it in the use, if a local business buys it here in Australia, many businesses set up with AI, the question is, where's the power going to come from? Because if you look at the production of Bitcoin, that's already takes an enormous amount of power to mine a Bitcoin. So add that on to AI, I wonder about the need and the ability to provide enough power in the future.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, and obviously, you know, that's one future demand of power is data centers. I understand it's the GPUs themselves that take a lot of power. They are running, you know, thousands and indeed millions of calculations in parallel. That requires a lot of power. There's a lot of heat, a lot of cooling required. I guess that's one, future demand of power is likely to increase over the next 10 years. There are going to be others as well, because as we electrify things, electrify vehicles, remove gas from domestic and industrial use, things will be more and more electrified, so there'll be more and more a need for electricity, electricity supply, indeed. So I think that's going to be an issue. Power demand is going to go up over the next 10 years. I think governments are, from my sense, thinking about that. There is a plan to deal with that. But you're right. Fundamentally, it's going to be an electrified world going forward, and AI is going to be one heavy consumer of that.
I'm trying to finish up here.
Thanks for your question, mate. I just want to add one thing: is that our progress is random in lots of ways. In a sense, I try to make the point that the last 20 years in China is unprecedented and unexpected, and it's got to be that no one really realised that China was going to end up where it's ended up. And similarly with power, I don't think there's enough comprehensive thinking about we're doing all this stuff, but it's going to make dramatic impacts on power, and the question is, where's the power going to come from? And I think people are sort of playing catch up in a lot of these issues. Over to you, my friend.
Right, I think we better stop there given the time, and so thank you everyone. If you have some more questions of our three speakers, feel free to approach them afterwards.